Yeah, so I think one of the real powers of QGIS is the expression engine, which is almost becoming a language into itself. So there are, you'll run into the standard functions in that. So the expression engine is where, let's say you want to calculate values in a new field or something like that, or select features. So with the expression engine, you get the standard character functions that you parse characters or numeric functions for converting floating point to integer and things like that. But there are hundreds of other functions in there for dealing with color and fuzzy math and fuzzy logic, time, all sorts of things. So these functions can be also used with these things called data defined override.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. My guest on the show today is Kurt Menke, and he is an absolute expert in QGIS. He's written several books on the QGIS project, and he's come along today to share his experience with the project, talk about how he got involved, share some insights to QGIS, things that you might not necessarily know, even if you've been working with it for a while, and where it might be heading as a project. Just a few short messages from me before we dive into the interview today. Firstly, consider subscribing to the show. I've got a whole bunch of great guests lined up for you, so if you're not subscribed already, consider doing that. That way, all the episodes will just be delivered to your podcast app, and you won't miss out on any of the great content we've got coming up. Secondly, if you know anyone out there that might enjoy this podcast, please share it with them. It would mean a lot to me personally, and it would really help grow the show and help spread the word about geospatial. So that would be great. If you do those two things, it would be amazing. So the last thing I want to mention is that Mapscaping, myself and my wife have made some socks for you. So what we're doing with these socks is we were looking for a way of supporting the podcast, of supporting the things that we're doing with it. It's taking an increasing amount of time. And please don't misunderstand me here. This is something I love doing, but I need to be able to support it in some way, shape or form. I'm not really into asking for donations from people. I really want to create something that would be useful, that would be a little bit unique. So we went on a limb and we made socks. So if this is something you might be interested in, it would be amazing for us. It would really help support the podcast, and I hope it would be like a unique gift or something that you might be interested in wearing. So check it out. It's if you Google socks Mapscaping or go to mapscaping.com and search for socks there. Yeah, we've got a couple of different pairs. It's been a really interesting project, making them, creating them, trying to find out what people like, what they might not want, and I would be really excited to hear your feedback on them. Anyway, please check them out. It would be much appreciated. Okay, so let's dive into the interview with Kurt. Hi, Kurt. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this with me. Much appreciated. We've tried this a few times before and it hasn't worked out for various reasons, so I am really hopeful that we can get through an entire interview today. Now, you are an expert in QGIS. And I've invited you along the show to tell us a little bit about QGIS as a project and perhaps where it's going in the future. So I think before we dive into that, maybe you could just tell us about how you got involved in the project and what your background looks like.
Sure, absolutely. So I've been doing GIS for quite a while. And I started, first downloaded QGIS in, I think it must have been 2005. It was at version 0.7, which was called Steamus. And, at the time it was, it had moved beyond its beginnings as a PostGIS viewer, but it still was pretty much just a data viewer. But I was really fascinated by it. So I kept following it. And by the time it got to 1.0, I was starting to see that it was becoming actually a really useful tool. I used to be at a university and I left the university position in 2008 and launched my business, which is called Bird's Eye View. And at that point, I started trying to base my business on open source software for various reasons. And the QGIS software just got better and better and better. And I've been relying on QGIS as my day-to-day desktop GIS now for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years at least. So as part of that, I'm a general consultant, but I'm also asked to do a lot of training these days in QGIS. So I've built up quite a few training jobs over the last several years. And I think part of that is because I've also authored at this point, it's hard to believe, but I've authored 6 books on QGIS. And in this last year, in 2019, I authored one called discover QGIS 3X, which is a large 400-page workbook covering all the functions of QGIS. And then I also co-authored a book called QGIS for hydrological applications with a Dutch colleague of mine, Dr. Hans van der Kwast. So yeah, I've been using QGIS for quite a few years, and I really love it.
Yeah, it is an amazing open source project. And speaking of open source, so QGIS is free to download. People can just go out there and download it and start using it. And I'm assuming a lot of the listeners of this podcast are familiar with QGIS, but as a workstation, as a tool. But what we're not so familiar with is perhaps the QGIS project. Could you speak a little bit about this? What does that look like? How do these changes, how do these updates come about?
Right. So it's a piece of software that is kind of built from the grassroots, from the ground up by a community of developers. And most of these developers are people who are making their living providing services with QGIS. The project itself was incorporated as a nonprofit in 2016. As it started to grow, they kind of needed to mature and, have a bank account and standard accounting practices and things like that. So that came along. So the project now is quite mature and has a massive community of people who use it and work on it in various aspects.
So you mentioned that briefly there, that there's developers that are working on QGIS as a project, but they're also earning their living from it. Could you speak a little bit about how this open source economy works?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing because the QGIS project itself has a fairly modest budget if you compare it to something like I can't imagine what Esri's budget is these days, but the QGIS budget itself is around 150,000, 200,000 euros a year, something like that. But of course, the economy around QGIS is much larger because there are who knows how many thousands of users making money using QGIS around the world, and it's kind of unmeasurable in a sense, but it's large. And most of the people involved in the project are, like I said, providing some sort of service using QGIS, whether that's just general consulting or actual development of new features and plugins and things like that.
So these people, of course, have a vested interest in making this the best of breed and the go-to geospatial product.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're using it, so they need it to work for their clients, their customers, and that's their focus. And I think that's another interesting aspect that I try to tell people about when I'm teaching an intro to QGIS course, for example, is that one of the real benefits of getting involved in any open source project like QGIS is that if there's something, a feature that you find lacking that's not there that you wish it had, you can build it or hire someone to build it or write a plugin to fill that, need. And so it's Anita Grazer, who's one of the, big parts of the community, has called it a duocracy, which is, kind of what I think of it as too. It's if there's something there that you wish it had, you can make it happen, which is really an empowering experience.
Absolutely, but I could imagine for a lot of people it'd be a little bit overwhelming as well. Like, where do I start? And I realize now that with regards to the plugin environment in QGIS, there's a lot of documentation around it, but it feels quite overwhelming to get going with something like that.
Yeah, it's certainly not trivial. The first time writing a plugin is an adventure for most people, I think. There is a lot of support, however. There's for example, if you're talking about plugins, there's a plugin builder plugin, which will kind of stub out the basic code that you need in any plugin. And there is generally a lot of documentation and support from the usual channels. There's a spatial community on Slack. There's Stack Overflow. There's listservs and things like that. You can get support for that kind of thing. And the community is generally very welcoming to especially newcomers who are wanting to take on something like that. And so there are people that are open to mentoring people.
Yeah, in my few interactions I've had with the QGIS community, they've been incredibly welcoming and really, really open to new ideas. And obviously, the fact that you can go on some of these places that you mentioned before and ask questions, and then there's an expert that takes the time to reply is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I think that's one of the real differences with working with an open source project is that that line between user and developer is much thinner. A lot of the developers are users as well, and you can interact with them directly, and that's a really fantastic thing. And I think it's that community that really makes QGIS the success that it has become.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that as well. Again, like I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people listening to this will sort of understand what QGIS as a piece of software. So we understand that it's a collection of tools. It's a standalone desktop editor. It's open source. It has a lot of the same sort of things we might find in ArcGIS. We can do data visualization. We can do data processing. We can do a whole bunch of other things in there. But just like ArcGIS, it's part of a wider environment. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things or some of the other products or perhaps software around QGIS that it plugs into, that it plays nicely with?
Yeah, that's I think one of the things that's made another aspect that's made QGIS possible is that there are other libraries that are kind of under the hood, if you will, with QGIS that you don't really, as a beginner using it, need to know are operating. But for example, there is a software library called Goodle and Ogre, or GDAL and OGR, depending on how you like to pronounce those. And those are for reading and writing different file formats. And so that means that QGIS can just read a silly number of file formats. And that's really one of the first reasons I started using it, was because I might have a client that would give me, a KML file, and instead of having to import it into ArcGIS, I could just drag and drop and pull it right into QGIS and work with it. There's also a library called Proj, which is how QGIS deals with projections. And then it also has a Python 3 environment that you can work with and it has there's a PyQGIS API that you can use to do processing. There are in the toolbox, there are other tools from other open source projects. There's one called Grass and there's another called Saga that you can use. So QGIS becomes in itself kind of a mini stack of geospatial tools.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's amazing how many different sort of and some of these, like Grass, for example, and Saga GIS, these are standalone products, but they're integrated into QGIS, and you don't actually notice that you're using something that's not perhaps QGIS in itself because the integration is so tight. I think it's really, really well done. So, what I meant with this question I asked you just before that was I mean, you did a great job of explaining how QGIS is built and what it's built on top of. But was actually referring to the wider environment because I know there's some other tools around QGIS. Yeah, I know there's databases, for example, that it plays nicely with. But there's also an offline solution, for example. Can you talk a little bit about some of those things that are sort of outside the immediate project of QGIS, but are really integral to the piece of software itself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you must be referring to the fact that there's a QGIS server, for example, which is a piece of software that allows you to serve out QGIS map documents as OGC services. There are two pieces of software for field data collection on smartphones and other mobile devices that are based on QGIS. There's one called QField, and there's another called Input. And so you can find those apps in the Android store, and I believe they are now both available on Apple as well, which was no small feat. And so there is an ecosystem of other related software around the desktop QGIS as well at this point.
And QGIS, of course, connects nicely with a variety of different databases, which is a huge plus when you're working with geospatial data.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I enjoyed your most recent interview on PostGIS, and that is a great database. When you combine all the inherent features in QGIS with its support for an enterprise spatial database like you get with PostGIS and PostgreSQL, you have a seriously powerful package. And as was covered in that podcast, the integration with PostGIS and the support for it in QGIS is fantastic. You can open up the database manager, connect to PostGIS and other databases as well. Write SQL right within QGIS, it gets passed right into the PostGIS database and returns the result. So you can actually, execute SQL, full SQL in QGIS, and it's very fast because you're interacting directly with the database. So it's a very powerful environment from that perspective. And another thing that is kind of along this lines in processing is that There's also support for R in the QGIS processing toolbox, so you can run R scripts through QGIS as well.
I think that's absolutely amazing. I mean, like we said before, QGIS is almost a stack, and what is a stack in itself. It's integrating a whole bunch of other software products. But then I think what really makes it an amazing tool is that environment around it, the ecosystem that it lives within. I think it's an absolutely incredible project. And of course, being open source, the barriers to entry are next to none. I mean, of course, there's a learning curve. That's the case with any new software, but you don't have to go out and pay a ton of money. You can just get started. And I think that's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, that's something I think is really important, for me personally, is it just that, kind of the democratization of technology, where you do reduce the barrier for entry. And when I've taught courses at my local university, most of the students have come through an Esri curriculum, and if they want to, for example, do what I do using Esri software when they graduate, they're in for a bit of a surprise with the licensing. And the fact that you can give people an alternative in that scenario for completely free and open source software that achieves all of the same goals really allows them, once they graduate in that scenario, to start working immediately and use all these tools.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not here to give Esri a hard time. This was the software that I learned on. I cut my teeth on Esri products, and I still think they're absolutely incredible. But of course, there is a barrier to entry. There's no question there. And I think what's been really interesting for me watching the QGIS project throughout the years is that sort of slow education where now in Denmark, for example, a lot of local councils are powered by open source in terms of GIS software anyway, and they're moving more and more towards QGIS. And I think part of that is because it's so much easier to understand what you're actually getting. I found with Esri, for example, oftentimes it was difficult to budget. How much is this actually going to cost me? And there was always my license only went to there, and but I need that other tool over there, and I need that to be able to connect to that. And don't get me wrong, I think there is a learning curve with open source software. There definitely is. But I think now the fact that it's being recognized as a real competitor, or a real alternative, I should say, to other paid software products is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not, just to be clear, I'm not anti-Esri by any means either. I grew up on Esri, and I was an Esri user and had my own license number for many, many years. So I'm very familiar with ArcGIS, and it's been fantastic software. And I think most people that begin implementing something like QGIS, that there's a practical side to all of this. These are just tools. They're
Yeah.
simply tools to get something done with spatial data. And so, I always think, you have, not just one screwdriver in your tool set, you need more than one. And so I think most people begin working with a hybrid environment where they use, ArcGIS or ArcGIS Pro for some things that it's really good at, and then they open up QGIS for other things that are more convenient there for them. And I think most people find that kind of hybrid environment is more the most practical way to get their job done.
If nothing else, I mean, it's always an advantage to know more, to have sort of more tricks up your sleeve, if you will, to have more tools in the tool case. That's always going to be of benefit.
Absolutely, absolutely.
One of the things that I personally think is really exciting about QGIS is the plugin environment. And I'm pretty sure it wasn't born with a plugin environment right at the start of the project's life. Could you tell me how that came about?
Yeah, well, just because I'm not a developer, so I don't have all the answers to that. But the plugin environment, I must have come in sometime around in the 1X line, I believe, is when plugins started coming into it. And so the part of that was developing the PyQGIS API that plugins were written in. So now the latest branch of QGIS, QGIS 3X, which is at version 3.10 now, has a Python API based in Python 3, and so that's what all the plugins are written in for the most part. And at this point, there are something like 500 or 600 plugins out there available that do, some are very small, some are very complex. They do all sorts of things. So the plugin ecosystem is fantastic, and there's new interesting plugins coming online all the time.
Do you have any favorites that you would like to mention here?
Oh boy, yeah. Actually, in my book, Discover QGIS 3X, I have an appendix on the top 50 useful plugins that I think are interesting. So there's a lot, but just I think one of the ones people use out of the box most frequently is one called Quick Map Services that allows you to pull in base maps via WMS services, WMTS into QGIS, so you can with that pull in OpenStreetMap and Google Maps and Esri based maps and all sorts of things. Something like, there's well over 100 different base maps you can pull in with that plugin. So that's really handy. And there are others for integrating with OpenStreetMap, like downloading data from OpenStreetMap right into QGIS. And the nice thing about the plugin environment and QGIS in general is that when you open up the plugin manager, you can just search for keywords and it'll filter the list based on that. So they're quite easy to discover and install.
Yeah, I think it's so clever. The whole system is really clever there, and really intuitive. So I'm a huge fan. Do you ever see really popular plugins being integrated into the project itself, sort of graduating from being a plugin to being a full blown part of the QGIS product?
Absolutely. And there's something like that happening right now. That another really powerful plugin is called Time Manager, which allows you to animate data with a temporal component in QGIS. And that has become so mature and popular that there's now discussions on bringing that into core. And I think in the next LTR, that might actually, which stands for long term release, that may actually be the a core part of QGIS. So that does happen.
You mentioned something really interesting before, and that was the integration provided, presumably through a plugin to the open source StreetMap project. So I know there's a couple of different ones out there that I've used anyway, and some of them you can edit directly in OpenStreetMap, I believe, and other ones let you download data. And I think that's pretty amazing. But I think what's truly fascinating here is it feels like QGIS is sort of moving towards being that default gateway to a lot of other projects because it's so. Now I'm not a developer either, but because it feels so easy to create a plugin, instead of saying to a user, here's an API, interact with that. People are taking it one step further, or companies are taking one step further and saying, okay, well, here's a plugin to QGIS, which a lot of people are using anyway, and this is the window you look into our world with. And I think, can you see more of that happening in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I because there's we mentioned Grass and Saga, and there are other libraries of geoprocessing tools out there like Whitebox and Tau DEM, and those are all now going to be basically the processing environment in QGIS is set up so that those can be added to the toolbox by a plugin. So there are people that are writing plugins so that you can bring more specialized geoprocessing tools from other projects into QGIS. And so now there's got to be another half dozen of those so that you can bring in other hundreds of other tools into QGIS and start using QGIS as a front end for those libraries as well.
Yeah, a recent example of this was the integration with Google Earth Engine, which I thought was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and I haven't even had time to play with that. That's one of the exciting things, and it's one of the challenging things with QGIS is that it has a really rapid release schedule and things evolve quickly. And sometimes with a new release, they come out with these change logs. So you can go online to the visual change logs and see all the new features in the latest release of QGIS. And it's kind of it's like Christmas morning where you see, oh wow, now you can do this, now you can do this. There's a tool that does this, and usually it's challenging just to keep up with all the new features and have a scenario where you can play with it or try it out.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I missed it there, or if you mentioned it, but could you give us an idea of the release dates for these? Is it every 6 months, year? Well, what does that look like? The release of new features or updates?
There's a new stable release every 4 months. So that 4 month period is built as 3 months of feature development and then the last month of bug fixing. So every or 3 times a year, there's a new stable release of QGIS. And because of that, several years ago, there was a decision made that every spring, the latest long term release or latest stable release would be called the long term release. So that release which is 3.4 now, would be supported for an entire calendar year with no new features but bug fixes. So, like with when 3.4 became the new long-term release, and then 4 months later, 3.6 comes out. Any bugs that were fixed in 3.6 get backported into that 3.4, but not none of the new features. So it becomes a stable piece of software that most production shops would choose, so that they can just have a stable version for an entire year. Because otherwise, most, I'm one of the people who is always installing the latest version to play with the new tools. But most people are going to prefer working with the long term release because it's stable and they can get their work done with it.
Yeah, which is obviously perfectly understandable. With that stable long term release, what happens when the new version of that comes out? Does that mean that all my QGIS projects that I have saved on my desktop, they are broken?
No, QGIS is remarkably backwards compatible. I've never had a problem in QGIS 3x even opening up older 2x map documents. So it's yeah, there's no issues that I've ever encountered with that.
So I've said this a couple of times already. I'm pretty sure a lot of people listening to this are familiar with the project in some way, shape, or form. But perhaps you could give us a few hints and tips because it's always changing, it's always evolving. Are there things buried in the project that you think people should know about that perhaps aren't immediately obvious?
Yeah, so I think one of the real powers of QGIS is the expression engine, which is almost becoming a language into itself. So there are, you'll run into the standard functions in that. So the expression engine is where, let's say you want to calculate values in a new field or something like that, or select features. So with the expression engine, you get the standard character functions, you parse characters, or numeric functions for converting floating point to integer and things like that. But there are hundreds of other functions in there for dealing with color and fuzzy math and fuzzy logic, time, all sorts of things. So these functions can be also used with these things called data defined overrides. And it's a little difficult to explain in a podcast, but basically these are ways that you can, for example, instead of pointing an input to a tool to a field, you can actually use an expression for the input to that tool. Or for symbology, you can use expressions. Instead of a color, you can have a color function that defines how a layer is rendered. And so there's a tremendous amount of power when you start diving into that aspect of QGIS.
Sounds like I have a lot to learn.
I was just going to add, like, another part of a second part to that question is the data visualization tools in QGIS. If I was to go back 5 years, the geoprocessing was fantastic. So QGIS has been a great processing, data manipulation environment for many years. But the data visualization and cartography 5 years ago was still a bit lacking. And I feel like that's one of the areas that it's grown incredibly in recent years. And it's become a state of the art cartography data visualization engine at this point. So it incorporates things like blending modes that you find in Adobe Illustrator and Acrobat, or I mean, Photoshop rather. These are standard things for blending one layer with another. There's layer effects where you can add drop shadows and outer glows to features, and lots of interesting renderers. There's another one called geometry generators, which uses the expression engine to change how a feature is rendered based on an expression. So, for example, if you have a polygon layer, you can render it as centroids, or you can render it as an interior buffer, and those are just two very simple examples. But that is one way in which QGIS is starting to develop new paradigms for how we deal with spatial data that are very unique to it.
That's really interesting. So I wouldn't need to create my own centroid layer as such. I can just say, instead of visualizing these polygons as polygons, show me the centroids, thanks. And it'll calculate that on the fly and show me that on the map.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and you can do other things that are quite a bit more fancy with those expressions. Because as I was mentioning before, another part of the expression engine is spatial expressions. So there is, there's a buffer function in there, and there's a centroid function, for example, and so you can do a lot with that with those tools.
That's one of the things that leads to the creation of a humongous amount of data. You know, if you have to render out centroids or buffers for every time you make an operation or something like that, if that becomes a step in your processing chain, I mean, you can quickly create a whole bunch of data and get a little bit lost in it. So I think that's fantastic, that idea of being able to render objects as different objects without having that sort of step in the middle.
Yeah, anytime you can get away without having to create a new flat file or something like that in a GIS workflow, it's a win. So I absolutely agree with you there.
Another thing that I think that's really cool about QGIS, although I have to admit here, I haven't played with it a whole bunch myself, is that sort of built-in model builder. Can you talk a little bit about that? What can we do with that?
Yeah, I think that's something that, to a casual user, they don't even realize it's there. But there is a graphical modeler that lets you add data sources and processing algorithms in a visual workflow, and basically create your own custom processing tool from that. Um, and so, that's the automation of a GIS workflow is always, the best way to go when you're going to be doing something over and over again. So if you're going to be doing a site selection analysis, for example, one of the steps might be, a certain distance from streams. And if you set up this whole, run through the whole process, step by step, and then your client or your manager decides, well, what happens if we change that buffer distance? What happens to the output in the site selection model? You'd have to start from scratch. But if you have it set up in a model, you can just go in and adjust that one setting and rerun it and get the result. So it's a great environment. You can even nest. You can use one model tool as another processing tool in a model. So it's quite robust.
It sounds a lot like the environment people might be used to in Esri products. And I think one of the magical things about what they do over there anyway is being able to export that to a Python script, a standalone Python script that you can run somewhere else. Of course, it has to go and get a license at some stage, but the idea that you don't have to be in your graphical model builder when you run that, I think is really powerful. Is that something that QGIS allows you to do?
Yeah, absolutely. You can export a model to a Python script. And so for people who want to get familiar with the PyQGIS API, that's a great starting place, because you can see what your model looks like as a script, and then run it from the Python prompt in QGIS and execute it that way.
I'm really pleased you mentioned that, because that was a huge help for me when I was learning Python. Being able to do that, build the model graphically first, so you understand how it fits together in a very visual way, and then you can play around with it, make sure it's running, and then export it and pull it to pieces, see how it was put together, and yeah, I think that's a really clever way of introducing yourself to Python, to programming.
Absolutely. And so yeah, the Python scripts are also supported as standalone algorithms in the processing toolbox. There's a Python editor in QGIS that you can use to experiment with some code before you run it. It's a very nice and often overlooked part of the interface.
Kurt, I'm just a little bit conscious of time here, but before I let you go, I've got a couple more questions. And one of them is, what can we expect to see from the QGIS project in the future? Is there anything on the drawing table that you think is particularly exciting, or can you see any sort of trends in terms of development?
Boy, that's a good question. I wish I had the crystal ball. At this point, it's pretty mature, but there are some new features that came out with 3. Like, there's now a native QGIS 3D environment. You can open up a 3D window, and that has been, it was functional but rudimentary when it first came out. And every version of QGIS that is growing tremendously. So I expect that to continue. You can animate 3D data. You can create keyframes, and so I expect that environment to continue to evolve. There's also support for a data model called mesh data, which is kind of sort of a hybrid between vector and raster. It has components of each, and it's commonly used for meteorological data, weather data, for example. And QGIS will support several file formats of mesh data and allow you to animate and visualize, weather through time in the interface. And so I expect that support for mesh data to grow as well, since it's also fairly new. And I'm sure there's been some other big changes recently to some of the underlying libraries, Proj and Boodle, for example. And so in QGIS, there's been a lot of development into making sure QGIS is working against those libraries recently. And I think one of the other areas that there's been a lot of discussion on recently is how to improve the documentation. Because of the recent because of the rapid release schedule, the documentation becomes a lot to manage, and it's done a lot by volunteers. And so there's been a lot of discussions on how to make that better, and so I'm sure that will improve as well.
Kurt, I've really appreciated you coming along and sharing your insights and your experience with the QGIS project. It's been fascinating. I've learned a ton, and I can hear that I've got a lot to learn with regards to QGIS. So thank you so much for that. Before I let you go, where can the listeners go to reach out to you if they want to learn more or follow along, or if they have questions for you?
Let's see. My website is birdseyeviewgis.com. I'm also on Twitter as GeoMenke. And I've recently started up a new endeavor called the Q Cooperative. So people can find me there at qcooperative.net. That's an umbrella organization between myself and several QGIS developers to provide QGIS support services. So I'm available at all those various locations.
Thank you so much, Kurt. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
And that's it for another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel, and I want to give a huge thank you to everyone who took the time to listen in again today. Much appreciated. As I mentioned at the top of the interview at the start of this podcast episode, if you could do me the favor and subscribe if you haven't already, it'd be greatly appreciated. And also, please share the podcast with someone who you think might be interested in. It would really help me out, would help grow the show, it would help to spread the word and create a community around what we're doing here. And lastly, check out our socks, Mapscaping socks. Just Google that. We made them for you. We hope you like them. Any feedback would be greatly appreciated. As always, you are more than welcome to reach out to me across the different social media channels. You'll find us on Mapscaping on Twitter and Facebook, and map_view on Instagram. You can Google me. You'll find me on LinkedIn as well. I'm reasonably active there, and I would love to connect with you. I would love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out. Until next time, bye.